They always say the worst storms don't happen outside the plane. They happen inside it. In those tense, suspended moments when the air feels thick with something you can't quite name. This was one of those moments, the kind that later gets replayed in 1,000 news clips and shaky phone videos. But if you'd been sitting in row 14 on that Atlanta to Denver flight, you'd remember it differently. You'd remember the silence before the first cough, the way people leaned just slightly toward the aisle without even realizing it, and the instant the routine of an ordinary trip turned into something none of us could ignore. And before I take you inside that cabin, let me pause to say this. If you've ever believed that every child deserves safety, dignity, and the right to breathe without someone in power dismissing them, then you're going to want to like this video, subscribe, and stay with me, because this is more than just a story. It's a warning and a reckoning, and I promise you'll never look at a flight attendant's authority the same way again. Now, here's how it began. Amara Carter was just 9 years old, small enough that her pink sneakers barely brushed the floor when she sat upright in her seat. And like many children traveling long distance, she had the fidgety restlessness of someone who both hated and loved the adventure of flying. Her father, David, a tall, calm man in his 40s with the steady composure of someone used to emergencies, had been quietly scrolling through a folder of documents on his tablet while keeping one eye on her. She had asthma, something the family had managed for years with a careful routine of inhalers, doctor's visits, and a lot of parental vigilance. But she was doing fine that morning, until she wasn't. At first, the sound seemed innocent enough, just a little wheeze in her throat after sipping orange juice. But within minutes her breathing changed, shallow and fast, with that terrifying rasp that every parent of an asthmatic child recognizes immediately. David leaned toward her, his voice low but urgent. "Do you have it, sweetheart? Show me your inhaler." Amara fumbled in her bag, pulled it out, and held it tightly, her eyes wide with both trust and fear, because she knew what that medicine meant to her body. That's when it happened. The first action that shifted this entire story from discomfort to crisis. A flight attendant, a woman in her late 30s with a name tag that read Melanie, stepped quickly into the aisle, plucked the inhaler straight out of Amara's hand, and said in a clipped tone that carried across the row, "Sir, passengers aren't allowed to use unverified medical devices during flight." The words hung in the air like ice water, shocking, ridiculous, but delivered with the kind of false confidence that dares anyone to question it. David blinked, stunned, then rose halfway out of his seat. "That's not an unverified device," he said evenly, though his voice carried steel. "That's her prescription inhaler. She needs it now." Melanie's lips pressed into a thin smile, the kind of smile that wasn't kind at all, and she shook her head like she was the authority in the room, like she knew best. "Children often think they can't breathe when it's just a cold or a little anxiety," she said with the casual dismissal of someone who had reduced a father's panic to an inconvenience. "She'll be fine. Let's not overreact." Around them, the passengers shifted, some turning their faces away, others pulling out phones because they sensed something unusual was unfolding. And Amara, she sat there gasping, clutching her chest, her tiny shoulders rising and falling like waves against rocks, her lips beginning to pale. David reached out his hand. "Give it back. Right now." Melanie shook her head again, and for a second, her expression hardened into something ugly, something that said she didn't just doubt his authority. She doubted his credibility as a father, as a man, maybe even as a black man daring to stand firm in front of her uniform. "Sir," she snapped, loud enough that the captain could probably hear it from the cockpit, "sit down before I have you removed upon landing. I won't argue with disruptive passengers." The irony was almost unbearable. A father begging for his child's medication, a child on the verge of an asthma attack, and a flight attendant insisting she knew better than both of them. The row behind them erupted in whispers, and someone muttered, "She needs that inhaler. Why won't they let her?" A woman across the aisle pulled out her phone and hit record, her hands trembling because she knew this was wrong, but also knew, instinctively, that moments like these needed evidence. David, meanwhile, crouched next to his daughter, his hand brushing her cheek, steadying her as he spoke softly. "It's okay, baby girl, just hang on. Daddy's got you." But his eyes were locked on Melanie, and they were not the eyes of a helpless man. They were the eyes of someone calculating, someone who had spent years in rooms where rules were written, Someone who understood that power could be challenged if you knew exactly where to press. He rose slowly, taller now, his voice still low but carrying across the cabin with a resonance that made the chatter die instantly. If my daughter can't breathe because of you, this entire airline will answer for it. Do you understand me? Melanie flinched, not from his words, but from the sudden stillness in the cabin. Every phone was up now, every passenger a silent witness. The captain's voice crackled faintly over the intercom, calling for calm, but calm was already broken. Amara gasped again, her little body shaking, and David stretched his hand out once more, his tone no longer a plea but a command. Her inhaler. Now, Melanie's knuckles whitened around the plastic device, as if surrendering it would mean surrendering her control, but you could see the shift, the awareness that she had pushed too far, that maybe, just maybe, she had tangled with the wrong man at the wrong time. And though she hadn't yet handed it over, though Amara was still gasping, there was something in the air now besides fear. There was the sense that David Carter was not finished, not powerless, and certainly not the kind of man you could silence with a uniform or a policy spoken out of turn. And that, right there, was the moment, the exact moment, when what should have been a private medical emergency turned into a public battle, a confrontation that would soon make headlines, ignite outrage, and expose the difference between authority and arrogance. But in that first terrible stretch of minutes, all anyone cared about was one thing. Would Amara get to breathe before it was too late? For a few unbearable moments, the cabin seemed suspended in some cruel experiment, every second stretching longer than the last, every wheeze from Amara's chest echoing louder than the engine's steady hum, every passenger caught between horror and helplessness, wondering how it was possible that a child could be denied something as simple, as essential, as breath. Melanie still clutched the inhaler, her jaw tight, her posture rigid, as if doubling down on a mistake could make it right. But David Carter was no longer pleading. He was transforming, and though at first the other passengers might have seen just a father in faded jeans and a work shirt, kneeling helplessly by his daughter's side, in that moment they began to see something else entirely. A man with the kind of composure that doesn't come from hope, but from experience, from training, from years. Spent in rooms where authority isn't assumed, it's enforced. He stood fully now, one hand still resting on Amara's trembling shoulder, the other outstretched toward Melanie, his voice dropping into that calm, dangerous register that makes people obey before they even realize why. Give it back. Immediately. The way he said it made even the businessman 3 rows up glance away from his laptop, his instinct telling him that something monumental was unfolding. But Melanie, flustered yet stubborn, snapped back. Sir, sit down, or I'll call the captain. You're being disruptive, and I will not tolerate threats on this aircraft. Disruptive. The word stung, not because it carried any truth, but because it was the word so often used to discredit, to diminish, to make legitimate fear look like aggression. David's jaw tightened, but instead of raising his voice, he reached into his jacket pocket, pulled out a worn leather wallet, and held it up for the cabin to see. You want the captain? He said, his eyes never leaving hers. Call him. In fact, I insist you do. And while you're at it, tell him that Deputy Director David Carter of the Federal Aviation Medical Board is on this plane, and that his crew has just violated Title 14 of the Code of Federal Regulations. For a heartbeat, silence. Then the words sank in. Passengers glanced at each other, eyes widening, phones snapping up higher as they realized the gravity of what had just been said. Deputy Director, Federal Aviation Medical Board. These weren't the credentials of a man bluffing his way into control. These were the credentials of one of the very people who dictated the rules Melanie thought she was enforcing. Her lips parted, her face blanching as the implications hit her. She hadn't just taken an inhaler from a child. She had just broken federal aviation law in front of the man responsible for enforcing it. You're lying, she whispered. But even her voice faltered as David flipped open the wallet and showed the unmistakable badge, its seal glinting under the cabin lights, the kind of insignia no one could mistake for a prop. The businessman who had been recording from across the aisle audibly gasped, and somewhere in the back a woman murmured, "Oh my God, he's the one who makes the rules." Melanie froze, inhaler still in her hand, but now her authority had evaporated, and it was David's words that filled the air with certainty. Federal Regulation 14 CFR Section 121.574, he said, his tone steady, professional, unflinching. Airlines are required to permit passengers to carry and use their prescribed medications, including inhalers, without interference. What you've just done is a direct violation of federal law, not to mention endangerment of a minor. He paused just long enough for the weight of the words to land on every passenger in earshot, which was, by now, all of them. Then his voice dropped lower, steel beneath calm. Now put it back in her hand, or I will ensure that this violation is the last time you ever wear that uniform. Something cracked in Melanie's face then, the realization that this wasn't just a parent she could dismiss. This was a regulator with the power to write reports that determined careers, to initiate reviews that toppled executives, to make phone calls that shook airlines from the top down. Her fingers loosened on the inhaler, and with a trembling hand, she placed it back in Amara's palm. The little girl lifted it instantly, pressing it to her mouth, releasing the familiar hiss of medicine, her chest rising and falling with desperate gulps of relief. The sound, the fragile, beautiful sound of a child's lungs beginning to open again, was followed by a wave of applause that started in row 12 and rolled forward like thunder. People weren't clapping for drama. They were clapping for breath, for life, for the sight of a father reclaiming what should never have been taken. But David didn't bask in it. He crouched again, steadying Amara as she inhaled once more, brushing her curls back gently, whispering, "You're okay now, sweetheart. Just breathe." When her eyes closed briefly in exhausted relief, he rose again, not with the urgency of a panicked parent, but with the authority of a man who had just shifted the balance of power in a single sentence. He turned to Melanie, whose cheeks burned with humiliation, and then addressed the captain who had finally emerged from the cockpit, irritation etched across his face. "What seems to be the issue here?" the captain demanded, clearly already leaning toward backing his crew. But David was ready. He pulled out a small notepad from his jacket pocket, flicked it open, and began documenting with a precision that unnerved everyone watching. "The issue," he said, "is that your crew unlawfully seized a minor's prescribed medical device, disregarded both federal law and a parent's testimony, and in doing so endangered the life of my daughter. I am noting the time as 2:43 p.m. Mountain Standard Time, flight number 2874, seat 14C. Captain, are you prepared to acknowledge in front of these witnesses that your staff violated Section 121.574? The captain blinked, his authority suddenly compromised, his glance darting nervously between the badge, the passengers recording from every angle, and the crew standing frozen behind him. "Sir, perhaps we can discuss this privately." "No," David cut him off smoothly, his voice carrying through the cabin with the calm finality of a gavel striking wood. "We will discuss it right here, because this isn't just about my daughter. It's about every passenger who's ever been told their medical needs were an inconvenience. This isn't private. It's public, and it will be addressed before this plane touches down." By now, the hashtags were already flying across social media. In row 20, a college student live-streaming whispered breathlessly into her phone, "This dad just shut down a flight attendant and pulled out a federal badge. Guys, this is insane. We're watching history right now." The livestream viewer count ticked upward by the second. Hashtag let her breathe, climbing into the trending column. Melanie slumped back, retreating down the aisle with her face pale, but David wasn't finished. He leaned forward, addressing the captain again. "You have two choices. One, you log this as an official in-flight medical interference incident, and upon landing you immediately file a compliance report with the FAA, acknowledging crew misconduct. 2, you attempt to bury this, in which case you will find that the FAA's deputy director has already filed a real-time record of the violation, with time-stamped witness accounts and live video documentation for multiple passengers. Which option do you prefer?" The captain's mouth opened, then closed. His posture softened, his face sagging into reluctant defeat. "Option 1, he muttered finally, the words scraping like gravel as they left his throat. The passengers cheered again, some standing in their rows, clapping, filming, calling out, "That's right." And finally, the businessman across the aisle leaned in, whispering, "Sir, that was remarkable." But David just shook his head, his hand resting once more on Amara's shoulder. grounding himself in the only truth that mattered. She was breathing again. The fight, though, was far from over. Because as the plane leveled out and the captain retreated to the cockpit, David lifted his phone, tapped a few keys, and sent a single message to a contact listed as FAA Legal, Emergency Protocols. The reply came within 60 seconds. Confirmed. Incident logged. Compliance team standing by upon arrival. David tucked the phone away, but the passengers around him had caught enough of the screen to know this wasn't just a father angry at mistreatment. This was the man who wrote the rules, now preparing to enforce them in real time. And as Amara rested her head against his side, clutching the inhaler that had almost been denied her, the cabin buzzed with something electric, something between outrage and awe, as people realized they weren't just witnesses to an asthma attack. They were witnesses to a reckoning. When the wheels touched down in Denver, the usual rush of relief that passengers feel at the end of a flight was replaced by a tension so thick it seemed to press against the fuselage itself, because by then everyone on board knew this wasn't going to end with a simple, "Thank you for flying with us." No, this landing was the start of something much bigger, and every phone in the cabin was already buzzing with notifications, because the world outside had been watching and waiting and was now demanding answers. The hashtags had exploded midair. Hashtag let her breathe. Hashtag inhaligate. Hashtag protect our kids, flooding Twitter, TikTok, and Facebook in real time. News outlets had picked up the live streams even before the plane's wheels hit the tarmac, anchors repeating the same words over and over. A 9-year-old girl nearly denied her inhaler by a flight attendant, rescued only when her father revealed he was the deputy director of the Federal Aviation Medical Board. Passengers whispered furiously as the plane taxied to the gate, some filming the captain's stiff announcement. "Ladies and gentlemen, please remain seated as law enforcement and airline representatives will be meeting us upon arrival." Others narrating for their live audiences. They're panicking. Guys, they know they screwed up. David sat upright, Amara leaning sleepily against him, her breathing finally steady but her tiny body still trembling with the aftershock of the attack. And if you had looked at him right, then you would have seen a man who wasn't angry in the way most fathers would be after nearly losing a child. No, he was calm in that chilling, deliberate way of someone who had already calculated the next 10 moves in his mind. Someone who knew that justice wasn't a maybe, it was a certainty, because he had both the authority and the will to make sure of it. When the cabin doors opened, the jet bridge wasn't empty the way it usually is. It was lined with uniformed airport police, airline supervisors in press suits, and 2 federal compliance officers wearing lanyards that made Melanie blanch the moment she saw them. Flashbulbs burst from the gate windows. Local reporters had swarmed the terminal after the story hit social media, shouting questions as passengers disembarked. "Sir, can you tell us what happened? Is it true the airline seized your daughter's inhaler? Are you pressing charges?" The crowd outside roared when David finally appeared in the doorway, Amara holding tightly to his hand, her pink sneakers dragging against the carpet. He didn't speak at first. He simply guided his daughter past the chaos toward a waiting paramedic team who checked her vitals while cameras filmed every second. Then, after ensuring Amara was stable, he turned back, his posture tall, his voice carrying with the kind of quiet authority that silences a room. "Yes, it's true. My daughter was denied her life-saving medication by a flight attendant who dismissed her condition as just a cold. This wasn't a mistake. This was negligence, and it will have consequences." Inside a hastily arranged conference room in the terminal, airline executives sat pale-faced around a long table, their laptops glowing with frantic emails from corporate headquarters. Stock price alerts flashed red on their screens, down 3.7% in less than an hour. Investor calls flooding in, hashtags trending worldwide. David entered the room without hesitation, flanked by the FAA compliance officers who had been waiting for him. And suddenly the balance of power flipped entirely. The executives were no longer the hosts. They were the accused, and every phone camera pointed at them made sure the world knew it. The airline's regional VP cleared his throat, attempting a conciliatory tone. "Mr. Carter, Deputy Director Carter, we want to sincerely apologize for the distress caused to your daughter." But David cut him off with a single raised hand, not angrily, but with the finality of a judge silencing a courtroom. "Save the rehearsed apologies," he said evenly. This isn't about my feelings. This is about your crew endangering a child's life in violation of federal aviation law. And this isn't going to be handled with PR spin. It's going to be handled with accountability. He laid his notebook on the table, the same one he had used to document the violation mid-flight, and slid it across for the officers to review. Timestamped notes, witness accounts, video evidence from at least 12 passengers, a direct violation of Section 121.574, and a pattern of dismissive behavior that reveals systemic bias. Melanie, sitting rigidly at the far end of the table, tried to speak, but David's eyes cut to her, and she froze under the weight of that gaze. You endangered my daughter. You endangered your passengers. You endangered your airline. You will not endanger another child again. The compliance officers nodded grimly, already drafting their preliminary report. One leaned forward. Deputy Director, do you wish to recommend immediate action under Emergency Protocol 47? David didn't hesitate. Yes, I recommend immediate suspension of the crew member involved, mandatory retraining for the entire flight staff, and an FAA-ordered audit of this airline's medical emergency compliance procedures. The room erupted, executives stammering, lawyers whispering, PR staff frantically checking their phones as stock alerts plunged further. But David wasn't finished. He stepped back toward the cameras, his voice shifting now, not just for the boardroom, but for the millions watching online. This isn't just about my daughter, he said, placing a steady hand on Amara's shoulder as she leaned against him. Every day, children with asthma, diabetes, severe allergies, and other chronic conditions fly on airplanes. They depend on their medication to survive, and too often they are treated as inconveniences by staff who dismiss their conditions or question their credibility. Today, that negligence nearly cost my daughter her life. Tomorrow, if nothing changes, it could cost another parent their child. That will not happen on my watch. The room fell silent, because in that moment David wasn't just a father. He was the embodiment of accountability, of a system subtly forced to confront its own failures. By evening, the airline CEO, red-eyed and exhausted, appeared on a live-stream press conference. "We take full responsibility," she said, her voice shaking as she addressed the cameras. "Effective immediately, all flight attendants will undergo mandatory medical rights training. We are instituting an anonymous reporting system for in-flight medical discrimination incidents. And we are committing $2 million to pediatric asthma research in partnership with the American Lung Association. What happened today was unacceptable. We are determined to ensure it never happens again." The statement was broadcast live to millions, but even as the CEO spoke, the split screen showed David standing outside the terminal with Amara, calmly answering questions from reporters. "What's your reaction to the airline statement?" one shouted. David's reply was razor-sharp but measured. "Words don't make children safer. Systems do. I'll reserve judgment until I see systems change in practice." And change came fast. Within 48 hours, flight attendant Melanie was terminated, her name already a trending topic as her actions spread across social media. The airline stock, after an initial plunge, stabilized as investors applauded the speed of reform. But more importantly, parents across the country began sharing their own stories. Children denied EpiPens, diabetic passengers forced to argue for insulin pumps, elderly travelers mocked for oxygen tanks. Hashtags multiplied. Hashtag let them breathe. Hashtag medical rights in the sky. Hashtag never again in flight. David found himself at the center of a national movement he hadn't asked for, but was now determined to lead. He launched a campaign called Let Them Breathe, advocating for legislation that would codify stricter protections for passengers with chronic conditions. Petitions flooded Congress. Senators called his office. Within months, David Carter was testifying before a House committee, Amara sitting proudly in the front row, clutching her pink inhaler like a badge of survival. "No parent," he told the lawmakers, his voice firm but breaking with emotion at the edges, "should ever have to fight an airline so their child can breathe. The right to medical dignity is the right to life." The bill that followed was swift and bipartisan. The Passenger Medical Rights Act of 2026, requiring mandatory federal training for all flight crews, strict penalties for interfering with prescribed medications, and public reporting of in-flight medical discrimination complaints. When it passed, the applause on the House floor was matched by applause in living rooms across America. parents hugging their children tighter, asthma sufferers wiping away tears as they realized they had been seen and heard and finally protected. The president signed it into law with Amara at his side, handing her the pen used for the signature. Cameras flashed as she held it up shyly, and the image went viral. A little black girl whose breath had once been nearly stolen by negligence, now immortalized as the face of reform. Months later, when the noise had quieted and the systems had begun to shift, David Carter stood at a podium at the National Pediatric Asthma Conference, speaking not as a federal regulator, not even as a father, but as a man who had learned in one terrifying moment how fragile life is, and how quickly it can be dismissed by someone in power who refuses to listen. Behind him, the screen projected statistics. Asthma attacks on flights down 62% since the new law's enactment. Compliance reports showing record improvements. Airlines advertising their medical rights training as proudly as they once advertised legroom. And in the front row, Amara sat with her inhaler resting on her lap, breathing easily, her smile wide, living proof that one man's refusal to be dismissed could ripple outward to change an entire industry. And if you ask the passengers who were there on flight 2874, they'll tell you the same thing. They didn't just watch a little girl take her breath back. They watched her father take control, and in doing so, they watched a system transform before their very eyes.